Netta, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for again joining us to continue our discussion about the various proposals related to the state's fiscal challenge. Today, we're really pleased to have Senator Shower join us. He's been serving in the Senate for, I think it's about 3 years now, and is from the Valley, from Wasilla. And we're pleased we haven't had an opportunity to meet with him before. So we're really pleased that he is taking the time to join us this morning and share with us the proposal he has just before he heads down to Juneau for the next special session. So with that, Senator Shower, I'll turn it back to Juanetta to navigate Zoom with your presentation. And again, we really appreciate your joining us. So thank you.
You're on camera?
I am.
Yes. And would you like me to bring up your slides now?
That'd be great. Thank you.
Okay. There you go. Hey, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And I'll just jump right into it. I'll try to keep it at more of a top level without getting too far into the weeds. So as probably everybody knows, one of the biggest battles we've had in the legislature, I've been there for 4 years. It's close, 3 or 4. I think you'd lose track of time there anyways. We have had, for lack of a better term, continuous battles over the budget since Governor Walker first changed the dividend amount, about 6-7 years ago. And we have a problem of our spending versus the tax revenue available to the state to pay for our spending. And I say that because for many years, this state, decades actually, the oil revenue that we were getting generally paid for everything and then some for what we needed. There's been ups and downs when you look historically, but the reality is we've gotten to a point in time where our tax availability is less when you include oil, royalties, taxes, what taxes we have in other forms, which is pretty small, and then the revenue from the dividend. And that pool has shrunk to the point where we've had to battle about, well, how are we going to pay for everything that the state has in obligations? That includes dividend. In 2017, that formula was changed from what would essentially be a pass-through fund where the dividend was just paid out. And most of our history, the other portion of the earnings was just put right back into the principal. And it's grown. We're somewhere around $81.5 billion. I haven't looked at it in the last week and a half for that, plus the other, for lack of a term, endowments or funds the state has, 12, 15 more billion. I can't even find the exact amount, but we're probably close to about $100 billion. So we have money. It's an issue of how we spend it and where it's used. And the other thing that's been interesting this last year and a half with COVID is we've gotten billions of dollars into the state that we didn't account for. So it's actually kind of interesting to note that we are kind of awash in money right now in this current battle. And of course, the COVID money will change. One more part of the assumptions that we are dealing with is right now, oil is the smallest part between the earnings of the permanent fund that is being used for state services and oil. Oil is only about a third, roughly, maybe a little more than that. And the majority comes from the earnings of the permanent fund. So on to the assumptions that the working group, oops, did I do that? Can I go back one? Just to make sure I get that right from the working group and brief it.
Sure, just give me 1 second.
No worries. I'll talk to you while you're pulling the slide back up. So the Senate Finance Committee and the House Finance Committee we have legislative finance, and they will give us products as we need help based on what we're looking for, based on information that a legislator or committee asks them. So in those assumptions, we had some briefs that were given to us in caucuses and different areas. And so I thought to myself, well, one of the most generic narratives that's being discussed by some legislators, but certainly not all, is, that we can only draw the 5% from the percent of market, value model that we are using right now. However, we have some conflict, as people know. We have a statutory formula that's been the law for 4 decades. And, for the last 6 or 7 years, that's been ignored. There was a Supreme Court case, for those that weren't aware, I'm sure you are, that Senator Wielechowski went to fight that, lost in the Supreme Court. And since then, the legislature has used that as justification to go, well, we can appropriate whatever we want. What has been interesting in this battle in the last couple of years or so, since that law was passed, which was SB 26, for the percent of market value, is now the argument by some is we have to follow the law. And so we have this conflict of some, well, if we're going to follow the law, why are we not following all the laws? The law of the statutory dividend. So do we pick and choose which laws we follow, or do we follow them all and change them? And one of the contentions you'll see is a number of legislators say we should follow the law until we change it. Now, that's been my approach. I'm like, I think we should follow the law and pay a statutory PFD. And if it doesn't work anymore, which I agree, the math is out of balance, then we change the formula. But there hasn't been the will to do that. We've been arguing from different philosophical positions. Now, that takes us to these modeling assumptions. So instead of going in an apples to oranges comparison and have some folks look at various proposals and say, well, your assumptions don't work, they're not vetted, they haven't been stress tested, et cetera. I wanted to go to Ledge Finance, and that's what I did. I looked at them, I said, I want you to, number one, use the exact same assumptions that Senate Finance did, so nobody can try to say that this doesn't make sense based on what they are doing. And I have sat on finance before. So that was one thing. So this is an apples to apples comparison, right out of the same assumptions that Senate Finance used and a lot of what the House Finance used. And they, of course, have a little bit of a different approach. This also right here, you can see the bottom bullet there, the budget's based on the fiscal plan working group's baseline assumptions. So I also wanted, as we went through this process, to make sure, and these are updated slides. I've been working on this for some time, and I don't want this necessarily to say that, well, this is Shower's plan. It really isn't. Yeah, this is a different group of legislators that wish to see a different approach. And there are some, as we'll talk about it, that have different ideas on how we pay for this government that we've kind of gotten to a point that we really can't afford, not with all the bills we have. So we are using revenue based on Department of Revenue spring forecast. We're using AFP or APFC, so the Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation's actual total returns. We're using the 6.2% return up through fiscal year 30, unless otherwise stated. We're assuming that that $4 billion went through. That basically is inflation proofing, but putting it into the corpus from the earnings reserve account this year. So that's going to happen. We assume we have $500 million left in the CBR. Sales and income tax revenue estimates are based on what DOR had for May of 2020. We have new revenue beginning in fiscal 23 if we're able to pass those measures. And we'll talk about those. And like I said, it's based on our working group assumptions that, by the way, as you know, the working group has liberals, conservatives, Republicans, Democrats, et cetera. And one more part, and you can go to the next slide, please, is interesting is that, when you go to the PFD itself, we're all over the map. There is no, it's a conservative or Republican or liberal Democrat. There are people on all sides of the spectrum that support it, support a smaller one, support none. There aren't many that would say zero PFD, but there are some, I think, that would prefer that when you talk to them behind closed doors. That's reality. So that's the assumptions. That's where we are. And when people were briefing that, well, we can't afford a PFD, we can only afford a small PFD, we can only not overdraw the percent of market value that's in the law. I wanted to say, well, if we paid a statutory PFD, what would it look like? I went right to a 50-50 instead of statutory, because the governor, as you know, I'm sure, put out a proposal, this SJR 6 and 7, these constitutional amendments. There's some that have been out for 3 years now. I was working on some of these almost same proposals in 2019 and 2020, didn't do much in 2020. I wasn't on many committees. And then, we started over again almost this year doing the exact same thing. So I said, well, if we start with the premise of a 50-50 PFD, trying to get people to understand that that may be something that is pragmatic. You don't have to like the proposals, because I say proposals, there's more than one. You guys are going to have somebody else or maybe have briefed already to you. But what can pass? And I'll tell you right now, folks, that if we go towards a statutory PFD, we fail, I believe, based on the number of votes, because you're not going to get enough people to vote for a constitutional amendment that would take it off the table. One of our goals here for most of us at this point is to get this off the table. We have been fighting this battle because of what was set up 6 or 7 years ago. And most of us, I think at this point, have been there like 4 years. We're tired of fighting this battle. This needed to be solved years ago. We needed to tighten our spending years ago, and it never happened. And we spent better part of 17 or so billion dollars out of the CBR getting us here. And we kind of continued the party when we should have been reining in spending. So now we put ourselves into this square corner where we have a lot of money, but we don't have enough based on the draws to pay for the government we have. So a 50-50 POMV draw of the 5% draw using 50-50, so 50% to the people in a PFD, 50% to the government to do with whatever it chooses, plus the inflation proofing, was the model I used, because if we go too far for no PFD, you're going to lose legislators. You go too far for a bigger PFD, you're going to lose some legislators. A 50-50 seems to be reasonable, seems to be fair as a split. And I'll tell you, from a personal principle perspective, one of the things I think we have a problem with in the state is OPM, other people's money. It's really easy to spend other people's money. I've heard a lot of different things said about the PFD. It's free money, people use it poorly, et cetera. I don't even care about the philosophical arguments, to be quite frank at this point. What I want to do is solve the doggone problem. I'm sick and tired of fighting about it. So how do we solve it? This 50-50, I think, has a chance to pass a legislature because it's something you can get maybe enough people to pull in and vote for. The governor has indicated, obviously, with his proposals, he would sign it. And I think it's something that people would pass. If you go to less than that, I think it's not going to pass. Like I said, I think we fail. So that's why you see 50-50 as a POMV model up here on all of my slides, just using that as an assumption. I don't see a lot of support inside the legislature for an income tax. The governor has also said in conversations with legislators that he would not, or he would veto an income tax. So as opposed to wasting time and going over an income tax or a flat tax to go through that, I just didn't go there because I want to find something that's going to work. Again, folks, I'm only interested in solving this problem we have given ourselves from the past. And then in addition to a broad-based tax, I went for the oil tax structure. As you know, there was ballot measure 1 last year. I opposed that. I thought it was too much, number one. Number two, I don't like when somebody else, one lawyer essentially writes legislation. I think it should go through the entire legislature, be vetted through multiple committees and eyes, and then, through the governor, and sometimes, depending on what is, even to the people. So, but at the same time, I have to show what the numbers would bring in. So here we go into the charts and the numbers. Remember that when you talk 50-50 for the POMV, a lot of people, including some legislators, will say it's just too much, it's just too big, we can't afford it. I'm here to show you that that's not true at all. And on top of that, you have to remember that we go to a 50-50 POMV at this point in time. If we were to do that and enact it tomorrow, that's 750 more million. So $750 million, roughly, more taxes to the government the moment this is passed. So when people say that it's too big, it's this, that, the other, you have to remember, we are giving about $750 million more to government, which already takes virtually all of our oil generated money at this point. There's only a few percentage points left when you look at the total take of government. So that's one, that people are giving up another $750 million. And it doesn't matter about your philosophy. That's the way a lot of folks look at it. So the second thing is we get to these different tax models and go, well, if that's what we landed on and we were able to pass it so that we got this off the table, started solving our problems and made the state stable and sustainable, what's left? After a 50-50, you still have a gap, so-called, of trying to pay for this government, including a PFD, of about $700 million or so. We just went through another entire briefing with Ledge Finance last night and where the charts are, about $700 million. You could, through about $200 million in cuts, or I say reductions to government spending, you can almost get there with doing the baseline of just that and some other tax stuff that the governor has briefed recently without doing anything else. However, there doesn't seem to be a lot of support, and you can see that inside the working group based on just the philosophies that are represented. So here we go with what they would look like. I used $200 million in some examples on the oil tax credit structure. I used $300 million I saw there was a very nasty article from the Anchorage Daily News editorial board talking about how terrible this idea was that I and some others have for the oil tax credit structure. But I'll remind you, what I used in these is either 1/6 or 1/4 of what ballot measure won. And folks, for this to be pragmatic and passable, it's got to be something that's going to be seen as fair. And if we do a constitutional amendment for getting the permanent fund off the table in one form or another, permanent fund dividend off the table, then it's got to be something that not only will the governor pass, the people have to pass. And so I wanted something that seemed fair and reasonable, but I believe we have to spread the pain out to make that work. Everybody needs to contribute. If you're going to ask for $750 million more from the people out of their wallets, if we're going to ask for some kind of a broad-based tax out of their wallets, I think the oil industry can probably help us out a little bit too. And there are other people that certainly want a lot more. I don't. I want it to be something that's balanced. So when you take this and you look at where we sit with this right now, you can see if you look at the top of the chart, you go to the fiscal years 21 through fiscal year 30, the red numbers show where we're still in a deficit and we don't have enough to pay for where we sit currently. And you can see on the bottom what the effective draw rate would be. 5.25% this year, it'd go up to 6.59, then it goes back down. But interesting to note, there are two types that we used, a South Dakota style and a Wyoming style sales tax. They generate different amounts. Those are used, I've been asked why. And the reason is that's because that's what the Department of Revenue used in this modeling. So versus trying to do something any different and get too far off the reservation, I just decided to go with those numbers. So you can see the ERA stays whole, CBR, we start to pay it back by fiscal 25. Go to the next slide, please. So in this case, one of the philosophical points I was looking, I want to be clear here, folks. I'm not a fan of a tax at all. I'm just not. But the reality is based on the makeup of this legislature, there's a lot of people that want tax. They want an income tax. They want some kind of tax. And a lot of folks on the more left side of the aisle would prefer an income tax. I don't want an income tax. I think it hits the producers the hardest, the ones that would spend the most. So that's one of the reasons I went with the sales tax. It seems to be there's a little less resistance to a sales tax. When folks talk about it, it's more of a user tax. So, and I've heard counters of, well, we want to get the money from folks that are working out of state in the oil industry, for example, because most of the workers, majority, they live outside of Alaska. That's fine. I understand that. But my counter to that is, well, what about the 2.1 million visitors we average get into Alaska? We don't get things from them, but a sales tax would capture some of that. I'm also cognizant that many of our municipalities use a sales tax, and so we have to be careful about how we add them up. So I look for the smallest number, and I was pretty amazed when I went through this and I can go as low as 1.5% on the sales tax, $200 million in oil tax revenue, and we're still paying off our bills here in a couple of years, but it takes longer to get there. So go to the next slide, please. You can see in this case, everything stays whole. I tried 50-50 on the PFD with $300 million oil taxes, 1.5%. And you can see everything works just fine. It just, the deficit gets a little smaller, a little faster. Next slide. I don't want to go too fast. And then you get the infamous, excuse me, the stress returns, right? Or this, you want to stress test it, because that was one of the things that was asked by a legislator on the floor back in May. Because these charts were contrary to the ADN's article, these were not hastily prepared. We spent some time working on these before. I handed them out to the entire majority caucus in the Senate before we went to the floor. I handed them out to all the senators on the floor. One of the questions was stress tests. And it's just something because, look, folks, to be quite frank, I'm not wedded to this as a plan. I want to be clear here as well. This is not like my plan. This is not going, you have to do this or else. And I'm not wedded to any particular numbers. Even however we get there, it doesn't matter what, say, 3% sales tax, 1%, don't care. 300 million, 400 million, 200 million, I don't care. The only thing I think that's probably pretty critical is the 50-50 on the PFD, because I think without that kind of fair split at this point, we're going to fail. We're not going to pass it and solve our problem. We're still going to be fighting about it. So put any numbers up you want. And I will add to this while we're looking at this as we get into the stress test portion, is that the governor himself has added other revenue measures, thinking that they might be able to do this and balance the budget and actually start paying back the CBR without a broad-based tax. Great. I think that's a fantastic idea if the math works and we can get there. But there are other things that I didn't even put in here that we can look at. For example, the property tax. It was a bill called SB 57 a couple of years ago. It was shot down, didn't get very far, but it was looking at a change to the property taxes on the oil pipeline running through the North Slope Borough and Valdez. I took heat from one of my towns, Valdez, because it was going to hit them. I didn't care. I said, if we're going to do this, we have to be fair and balanced. And, you guys want to have your cake and eat it too. Sorry, we're going to have to, look at how we would generate more taxes from that. The governor apparently has some authority to do part of that, at least. We looked at ComFish, we looked at mining, we looked at Medicaid taxes. We were just briefed last week, we're the only state in the union that doesn't have this Medicaid expansion tax something on it because it's not my bailiwick. But there are other things that we can do. And I'm game for all of that, ladies and gentlemen, as long as we solve the problem. One way or another, we have to solve the problem. And one last put as we get into this is that I think a discussion that's very important. It has been easy with that OPM, other people's money, for a long time for the legislature and governor to spend money and not have to worry about it. And the people didn't have to worry about it because somebody else has been paying our bills. We've gotten to a point with expansion and the size of the government that now we're having to look at how are we going to pay those bills. Well, the easiest and low hanging fruit has been the permanent fund dividend. Personally, that's a place I don't want to go because once again, we hurt the Alaskans that need the help the most, the bottom half of the middle class, the poorest Alaskans. And it's a mechanism that helps a lot of them, for example. And the same thing with tax, right? That's also going to, come out of people's wallets. It's going to hurt, but it forces legislators, if we're going to spend more money, they're going to have to go have a hard conversation with their constituents about why they're taking money out of their wallets if they want to spend more money. And that's a conversation I think we desperately need. And I think that when we look at the top tier of the income earners in this state, of which, by the way, as an airline pilot, I would be one, we kind of get off without having to pay much and for the state government. And so it's probably a conversation that we need to have. Many other states have that. And while I'm not a fan of an income tax, I believe we have to get to a point where legislators are not able to just spend money, take it from wherever they want and not have to worry about it. I think they have to have a hard conversation. And if you want to look at that for an example, look what's happened with the PFD. Governor Hammond predicted this. He had that militant ring around the PFD. Well, we've been touching that for years and look at the battles. People are upset, highly upset. And that's a good thing because that means your legislators, your politicians are held more accountable because they're having to answer some hard questions. So if we stress test and go, what happens if we go to the fiscal years 00 through 08 returns? Same basic assumptions, 50-50 POMV, a 1.5% South Dakota sales tax, the one that has the least exemptions. So you get more revenue from it, more taxes, and $300 million, you can see we still do just fine. So even when we have the stress test, it still takes us to about 4 fiscal years from now. And the draw goes down to basically the 5% by fiscal 24, and then we're paying back the CBR. Go to the next slide, please. If we go to the worst case, and I want to be clear on this one, because everybody goes, oh, look at the right chart, that's terrible. But remember, a couple baseline assumptions here. Number one, this is for going into fiscal year 22 and 23, working directly with the legislative finance director, because he was very helpful in this for me to go, will this work or not? And he's like, you have one of the few ones that would work no matter what. This not only assumes the worst return years the permanent fund has ever had in our history, it also includes, when you see that big drop, the $4 billion transfer. So we added that to make sure that was included in here. Plus the take from fiscal year 22 for the POMV draw. So that's where you see that big green column go down. And even with those big draws from that, based on what we've done as a legislature and what we would normally take, plus the worst return years we ever had, folks, still by fiscal year 25, when you look at it, we've essentially gone down to the 5% draw. And after that, in 26, we start to grow it again and put it back. And that's assuming the worst case possible scenario we've ever encountered, it still works, or something like this still works. And then we start paying back the CBR. And remember, I want to caveat this is, again, without any other revenue or tax. I hate the word revenue, it's taxes. You're taking money from somebody at some point when we do these things. And so you, even at the worst possible years, without any other measures included in this, with only a 1.5% sales tax broad-based, we're still making the math work, because ultimately, folks, this is a math problem. We got to make the math work. We've got to balance this budget moving forward in a way that is fair and balanced and will pass the legislature and the people. Next slide. Maybe if you couldn't hear me, I don't know, just if you go to the next slide, please. Or that may be the end.
Yeah, I think that's the end.
Okay, good. So what I'll do here is I don't want to spend any more time on the slides. I would prefer to answer questions from folks that have them for things that I'm seeing with this, how this is working. and what people's different thoughts are, because I can see the broad-based crowd we have here, and it represents a pretty diverse group of opinions. But ultimately, folks, at the end of the day, I want to be clear on this again. I'm not wedded to a particular solution. There's some things that I don't support for different reasons, but we have to solve the problem. We have a problem not of money, because we have a lot. We have a problem in some ways of spending, because it has been exceedingly difficult to reduce the cost of this government based on the various interest groups that make it very hard to do so. But we have to get to a point where this is off the table. One way or another, we have to stop fighting about the permanent fund dividend, and we have to figure out after that how we're going to balance this budget and how we do it. And there are different approaches to that. And when somebody can show me they can balance the math in a way that's fair and balanced, that's fine. So I'm over to questions.
All right. Cheryl, do you want to start off with any questions?
Oh, sure. First, thank you, Senator, for sharing the work you've done. And we have spent the last couple of months talking with various legislators about this very issue. And we also did a Budget Choices website. It was an interactive website. I don't know if you had an opportunity to see that. We did share the results from your district. But overall, on the question of the dividend, 12% of the respondents, and we had almost 2,200 responses, 12% said pay the statutory formula, 12% said pay the last 3 years, and the rest of the folks said, gee, pay last year's amount or suspend the dividend completely. So what is the basis for concluding that the dividend is the most important program that should be guaranteed funding every year? What's the philosophical policy basis for concluding that it should be put into the Constitution? Why?
I'll give you probably the most pragmatic answer to that: politics. Not because I think it's the smartest thing in the world, because there's a lot of things here that are driven by politics, and a lot of people don't like that. I don't like the job, to be quite frank. But what you are dealing with when you look at this, quite simply, it's a math problem, right? I mean, look, it's a math problem. We got to balance the budget. We got to make sure that we have enough taxes coming in to pay for our government. We hopefully do it smartly. We try to make sure it's efficient, but it's government, and you have people on different sides of the political spectrum. And I'll go back to that. The dividend is not a Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal problem, whatever you want to call it. We're all over the map as a legislator. You got people that are, what you might call a liberal Democrat that are very strong supporters of paying the statutory PFD, and they don't want to step off of it. You've got conservative Republicans that probably want to pay less of a PFD. Some of them nearly a 0 one. There was one, a couple of years ago, that was a 0 PFD guy. So the biggest part of the answer to your question is politics, not policy. And unfortunately, you can not agree with the direction this is headed, but if you don't do something that's going to be perceived as passable, number one, the legislature, the governor, and the people, and you don't do something that's going to be perceived as fair when you take that across the board, we're going to fail to pass it. That's part of your problem with this now. So if you divorce the politics from it, you could go, like, so this is just a math problem. That's all I did with the slides. Again, it's a math problem. Let me find something that is going to work and balance the budget. And moving forward is stress tested, so I know that it will work. Great. And then people start hitting it and go, well, what about this tax? And I don't want that. And I don't want to, it's too much for the PFD. And then you go, see, here we go. It goes right back to politics again. You go, how do you solve this problem if you don't have something that is pragmatic enough that could pass the legislature? So I will also tell you that, the content, not yours necessarily, but the contention that people don't care about the dividend, I think ought to have been at this point blown out of the water by the reaction of the people for the last couple of years. And depending on which poll you look at, of course, any pollster can give you any results you want based on how you ask the questions. And I can say that because you look at the House poll from just a few weeks ago or so, and they had a poll that showed, well, the people don't really support the PFD, the 50-50. Well, but you asked a question that didn't really talk about what it was. If you explain it all and you look at some of the other dividend polling, and I'll give you an example from 1999. Remember, the question was asked by the legislature, no, use it for government. And the result for the people was an overwhelming no. I think it was 77% or something. The people said no. So 20,
83%.
what was that?
83%.
Thank you. Even better.
And the question that was on the ballot, though, respectfully, was not just about the dividend. It was, do you want to cut the budget? It was a whole menu of choices. And so it gave everybody a reason to vote no. It wasn't just about the dividend.
I understand.
Okay.
But look at what we went through back in 2019. The same policy decisions about taking the permanent fund dividend, the result that we had there, and that was specifically about the dividend. That wasn't other policy questions. That was dividend only about it. You know, the same kind of constitutional amendment, something of putting it in there. The results were even higher. We had over, I believe, 1,000 people testify, and it was like 79 or 81%. Again, don't hold me to the numbers, but the people that wanted to see the dividend put into the Constitution, they want it protected, they want it put away. Overwhelming. And even this most recent roadshow, if you will, where the fiscal plan working group went to a couple different towns and had the town halls. Even in Anchorage, there's still the majority of the people, not as many, but the majority still preferred to see the dividend paid out. And of course, the Matsu and Fairbanks, we've got Senator Kawasaki in here, he could talk to it. You still saw that result from people as a majority. Now, again, I don't want to be, held accountable to say, well, you just think you pay the PFD and that's the most important thing. I don't think that it is. I think the most important thing here that we have to deal with is the politics of it. And so there are different ways that we can make this work that will not hurt our businesses as much as it could with other proposals. One of those being a stop whipping the oil industry around like we do every couple of years, because we have a spending problem as we do, and then we just change the tax structure to get what we need to pay for it. We're not a stable place to do business. And unless we start honoring our agreements like we did with the oil tax credits, unless we start showing people that we can limit our spending with a spending cap change in the Constitution that we currently have, which I'm also a proponent of, then I think we broadcast to businesses, this isn't a great place to be, because you don't know what Alaska is going to do. So I will go back to, I hear you loud and clear. And if putting the PFD in the Constitution is the only way, or some version of that we're going to solve this problem, well, I'm back to ask you, what else are we going to do? Because if we don't do that every single year, we're going to keep fighting about this, and we're not doing other things we need to do. We're not solving our problem. So look, I forgot your name there. I think it was Cheryl. This is a vexing problem for us that has been handed down, and we have to solve it. I could go from putting the formula in the Constitution, which I will be frank with, I'm not a fan of cracking open the Constitution for this. I'm not. But if you don't put this in there, we're going to fight about it every single year. And we don't even know what our budget's going to be. How can we? We don't know what the dividend is going to be. Is it going to be the whim of a Senate Finance co-chair this year? Is it going to be the statutory? Is it going to be 50-50? Is it going to be $1,000? Is it going to be $500? Is it going to be $0? I don't know. We need to know that going into this every single year. And there's only one way, and there's only been one thing, apparently, that we can't seem to jump over as a legislature, following our own laws. And that's been the Constitution. So if that's what it takes, I'll go there, even though I don't necessarily want to, but get this thing off the table so we're done dealing with this mess that we have, so we can solve the rest of this, become a stable place to do business, hopefully entice businesses to come and stay here, and moving forward, be a better place. So I don't know if that really answers your question, other than to say that I think it's perhaps the only thing that's going to keep us from fighting about this moving forward. There is a thought process of saying something about putting the PFD in the Constitution, that there will be one, and then the formula and statutory form, as opposed to not having a formula. And I could live with that too, potentially. The problem we may circle back to is in the legislation says, well, yeah, sure, there'll be a PFD, it'd be a $1 PFD. So we're back to fighting again. So I don't know, Cheryl. There's no perfect answer here in any of this. I'm not a fan of taxes. I want to be clear on that. I'd rather keep that in the pockets of people and businesses so they could spend it back inside the economy. But the reality of where we've been put is I'm trying to balance the math, and I'm trying to balance the math in a way that's going to work and pass a body that's very divided. And there's various proposals. So, but if you go too far past the 50-50, I think you're going to lose too many legislators to make it pass. And I think it wouldn't pass the people's. once it is put forth for a vote. Hope that at least somewhat answers your question. I'm struggling with it, Cheryl, because I don't like any of these things. I just trying to find something that's going to work. Bottom line.
Sad, sad.
All right. Well, just as a reminder to the audience, we can take your questions in the chat feature. So please submit your questions there and we'll present those. If you prefer to have your question posed anonymously, just please note that as well. Senator, I'll throw one out at you. In trying to make the math balance in a way that you feel is politically acceptable, in a way that will get through the legislature and reach some sort of resolve on our fiscal questions, your solution combines what you had said, that you're not wedded to certain aspects of it, but your baseline is the 50-50 plan with some combination of new revenues to make the math work, and eventually over a period of years get us to a point where we're back to a 5% POMV. I want to just tease out a couple of pieces, and one of which is that you sort of started to touch on, which is new oil taxes. And just as context, we have in recent years had several statewide initiatives to attempt to change the oil tax structure, and those have failed. And so it seems the populace the electorate could have changed over the last several years, but we've had one that has just failed recently. We also have an oil industry that is facing fairly significant headwinds, and not only economic headwinds, but perhaps societal headwinds that may be changing people's feelings about the oil industry. And I've worked in community and economic development for most of my life, and when your prime economic driver is hurting, the thing that you don't do is try and inflict more wounds. And so the question would be is that in understanding the timing for the state is right, perhaps to generate more taxes, more revenues, but in the context of all of those things facing the oil industry right now, why would we be pursuing additional taxes against this industry?
You answered part of the question when you said the dynamics are changing, right? And this continues to go where it seems to be further and further that people are starting to accept that, whether that's who's moving up from other states and their philosophical principles when they get into this state. You can see it's definitely changing. We're not, we're still a red state politically, kind of, but the dynamics have changed some. There's a lot of places like Anchorage that are purple. They're not really red per se, depending on the percentages. So in part, I will answer that by saying, what you said there does answer part of your question, that I think you're seeing some of those changes societally, et cetera. You look at ballot measure 1, it failed, but that was a big hit, right? $1.2 billion, roughly, plus or minus, et cetera, how it went opening the books of the tax records of companies. I'm like, good Lord, we wouldn't want our own personal tax records. That's crazy. So I didn't support it, and I didn't think it was the right path. I did support it, said, if we're going to do this, if we're going to change it again, then we should do it. And I say we, the representatives of the people, the legislature should look at this. We should take our time, slow it down, vet it, make sure it makes sense, it works, and an overall math formula that solves the problem we have, not just go back to the oil industry every couple of years, because that's part of what got us here, is this reliance upon oil like crack. We're like crack addicts when it comes to oil. It was the money that we were getting. We were spending it on whatever we wanted, and we got too used to that. And unfortunately, we have somewhat divorced ourselves from paying for state government by using all of these other sources of income and never having to really pay for it out of pocket. So I agree with you in essence, because that's one of the reasons I'm such a strong supporter of changing the current constitutional spending cap. I think we need to do better than what we're doing now. And I talked to the AOG executives about a year and a half ago down in Juneau. They didn't like what I was saying about, guys, you're going to have to cough up something. You're going to have to help me out here, right? Because I go back to my answer. It's politics. It doesn't mean it's the best business policy. It doesn't. And I agree with that. But it's also politics. And I said, if you're going to ask us to look at the people and go, give me another, $750 million out of your wallets via the permanent fund, taking it. You're going to give me more than that, I'm going to take it. I'm going to take a tax out of the people to pay for this government. Fine, it's our government. If that's what people are saying they want, we got to pay for it. But if in that process, I'm asking for $1 billion plus of people to put more out of their pockets to pay for the state government, it's going to be very difficult with the pressure that you've mentioned yourself that we're seeing on the industry to not do something. And I think that if we're going to ask them, I say a small change, something that's not unreasonable, like I said, I can go 200 million, 300, name a number. I'm not wedded to it. Something that says, hey, we are asking them to contribute to this as well. But where I will diverge from this is if this is just going to be a statutory change that the legislature is just going to ignore the law again, moving forward the next few years, if we're not going to make some changes to the constitutional spending cap, so we show moving forward that we're going to constrain ourselves so that we are good business partners at a state, it's going to get much harder for me to support this. I'm not a fan of just going back every year and going, hey, oil industry, cough up more, give us more money because we can't control ourselves. I don't think that's wise. I agree with you. It's still our primary business. Oil and gas still pays the largest percentage outside of the earnings from the permanent fund to pay for the state. I want to constrain that. I want it to be reasonable and as fair as we can get it. So that's the reason, is back to almost everything you guys are going to ask is politics, is something that's going to allow us to go, look, folks, I'm asking you to give up this money from the permanent fund because we've got to balance them out. I'm asking the oil industry to do it too. I may ask the medical industry, may ask whatever, kind of stuff. And I'm asking the government as well to reduce and constrain itself, because a part of this equation in there is reductions to spending. That's been one of our, strangely, not really, I guess, one of our biggest battles is, I thought that $200 million I put in for reductions in this plan was not unreasonable when we have a, $12.5 billion state budget, pretty small numbers. And I used 200 million because the governor did, because that's what's in his fiscal year 23 and 24 plan. So I'll just throw it out there so we have something. I'm not going to go crazy with $500 million cuts because politically that was a nightmare. We went through that a couple of years ago. So I hope that makes sense as an answer. I'm not a fan of big changes with that. And I want it to be as small as we can get it. And I want to see us moving forward with a comprehensive plan, which is why we need something like this or some version of a plan that is comprehensive, that solves all of these things. Because if we do just one or even two of those things, we haven't solved our problem. And if we don't constrain ourselves moving forward, we still haven't solved our problem. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think so. I want to just touch on one point, which is, well, let's talk about spending for just a second. Certainly, there are many people online with us today that are great advocates of budget constraint and discipline. And yet, both in our Alaska Budget Choices online project, the 2,200 Alaskans that submitted, really across the board, fairly consistently, with the exception of the governor's office budget and the legislature's budget, really those Alaskans were saying, we don't want to see any more budget cuts. You heard the same thing when Governor Dunleavy presented his first budget. And I certainly personally, I've worked in state government at the director level, and I can tell you, I think there's always room for some cuts. But looking at where we are, expecting to see significant cuts, I think is probably unrealistic, both from the standpoint of where we are with spending and what Alaskans are willing to tolerate. And so, we've just seen evidence that Alaskans really aren't willing to cut much more. So, really, what can you say to any of that in terms of where you expect to find significant budget cuts or budget discipline moving forward?
Well, let me correct a little bit of that. As you can see, I don't think $200 million over several fiscal years is very much out of a $12+ billion budget. So the governor doesn't have proposed what those would be. We've been talking about it in this working group for some time. I'm not going to say too much about the working group internal, because we agreed we were going to keep that internal until we release those findings so that we could, freely converse without feeling like everybody was going to run to the press and leak it to their buddies or their staff, because we were having some issues with that. That's politics. I got it. So really, I acknowledge, even in the one that I put forward, and I've been working on this for many months and long before really anybody else had individual plans out there. I mean, I'm just in this kind of context, but this is a group effort, right? I mean, I'm looking for something that will pass, and there are other ones, and there will be a blend of something. This isn't my plan. Like I said, it's going to be a plan, part of a plan, I hope. So really, I acknowledge that by saying, look, $200 million, $100 million in fiscal 23, 100 fiscal year 24 is not much, right? And quite frankly, the Senate Finance Co-Chair briefed us earlier this year that we had roughly about $150 million of planned increases to government spending every year. That's not my words, that's his words, briefing us. So if you go $150 million of increases and we only took that, you basically take 100 million of that out somehow through various mechanisms, you reduce this, you do that, you go, we're still increasing the size of this government. Even if you had $100 million every year and that's all you did, you're still increasing the size of this government. And that's based on, PERS and TERS and contracts and all kinds of other stuff that are just locked in, if you will. So I'm acknowledging, again, the problem you highlight, the politics of it. We tried significant cuts years ago, and look what happened to us. We fell apart. There was a mushroom cloud over Juneau and Wasilla as we went back and forth when we tried to, reduce the cost via vetoes. It was a nightmare. I'm not a fan of that process again. It wasn't fun the first time. I'd really rather not do it again. So I am acknowledging in this plan and others that we are going to struggle, even if we found reasonable cuts that did not reduce government services that people appear to want. It's going to be a struggle to do so. They have to be vetted in the legislature. They have to make sense. They have to not reduce services that people want. I'll go back to my same problem. We got to pay for it then. Okay, you want this size government? We got to pay for it. And we're going to have to ask something that's going to politically, pragmatically pass the entire system, the legislature, the governor, and the people, to make that work. And so I acknowledge your problem. And that's why I did not put in big, significant cuts. However, I also think philosophically, principally, that we should always be looking to be more efficient as a government, right? I mean, what do businesses do? Businesses don't get to go, we're going to spend $500 million more this year, and we're just going to go raise our prices because everybody's going to pay it. Well, if their competitors don't do it, they're not going to survive. So businesses are forced to provide better services and try to do it cheaper. That's how you make money. While the government's not a money-making enterprise, we should at least be philosophically, in my opinion, looking at it that way. Are there ways to be more efficient with the services we provide and do better services, but still save money? And I will go back to this from the Commonwealth North perspective overall, is that if we want to entice people to move to Alaska and start their business, if we want to keep people here, then we need to have a good, stable business environment, and showing that the government can constrain itself and always be looking for better, more efficient ways to do business. Then that's a positive for us. That's not a downward trend. That's a positive trend, and we need to be doing that. So long answer to your short question to say that I basically, I'm not counting on a lot of reductions in this process to get us there. There's no way we're going to reduce the cost of this government politically to get to where we need to be. You can like or hate that, doesn't matter. You can scream from the mountaintops like some people are. You must cut to get there. I go, I gotcha. How am I going to do it? How do you propose we get there? Even the governor can't do it. And the legislator fought him tooth and nail too with the vetoes. So politically, it's the answer for almost all this. You could look at it and go, that's just stupid, Mike. Why would you do that? I go, politics, not because it's smart. Give me another way that's going to succeed in getting through this legislature. And I'm all about it, but you better come up with some good answers, because so far I can't find them.
Well, I think the reality when looking at budget cuts is that there are vast portions of the budget that are essentially held harmless from the cuts. And those tend to be, again, the biggest portions of the budget. So healthcare is an area where we don't seem to have a lot of control and discretion as a state. And we have a strong bias towards funding education. And so what's left in the budget, and when you're talking about the level of cuts that you're talking about, are actually fairly draconian on that very small wedge of the budget that's left. And I think that's what Alaskans are responding to, is that we are at what are, I guess I would characterize as threshold services by those agencies that are left that will bear the biggest brunt of the cuts.
Yeah, who wants to cut to public safety, right?
Right.
I mean, Department of Corrections, where you have inmates that have committed crimes and been convicted. How do you get past some of these numbers? And education, like I said, that's a hard one to touch, right? I mean, touch the formula. Oh my God, the world stops spinning. I mean, people just get really upset, and the teachers all show up in mass, and everybody gets really, really angry. Saw that a couple of years ago. And the three biggest areas, you named them. It is education, it is healthcare, and then the permanent fund dividend. Those are the three biggest columns. If you look at, what the obligations are we have to pay. And I'm going to remind you folks, we still have obligations to pay that. There is a statutory formula that's still on the books, and it says that. And even one of the senators that's kind of, I hate to use the word anti-PFD, but as a proponent of a small one, said it on the floor not too long ago. There's $6.7 billion sitting in the earnings reserve account that, according to that formula, should have been paid out. And we didn't follow the law. And I know that people say, well, the Supreme Court said you don't have to. So then why do I have to follow SB 26 on the draw? Why do I have to follow any of our laws when it comes to appropriating? So,
well, that's because that is the legislature's responsibility. I would submit to you, and I'll steal some of Cheryl's thunder here. She likes to remind us there are other things on statute, in statute that we don't do, that we don't
Correct.
pay for. And I can tell you that, even in the very small division that I used to manage, there were things in statute and regulation that weren't funded in the budget. We just didn't do it. That's the legislature's prerogative. And that's what you're sent to Juneau to do, is to make those difficult choices. And at least you do have a framework that both from the Constitution, what is in statute, and case law that says it is your prerogative to make those decisions.
it absolutely is, but there are also consequences for your actions.
Absolutely.
We have put ourselves upside down with the politics of this because we didn't do it the right way. And the right way would have been, the math doesn't work. We're spending more than we have. We're drawing down our savings account, change the formula, make it work, make the hard choices. But I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to listen to that argument and throw it right back at you and go, if that's the answer that you just said, then why didn't the legislature take it up in arms and change the formula and get this off the table? And I'll tell you why, because it was too doggone hard to do so. And we had money to spend out of the CBR. We have been taking the easy road for years now, and it's time to make hard decisions. You want us to make hard decisions? Fine. I'll make a hard decision. I'm going to take some of the PFD and I'm going to give it back to government. I'm going to take taxes. You want to balance the math? You want a state government this size? Then doggone it, we're going to pay for it. How are we going to do it? That's the question. So the legislature did not do its job, I would argue, by making those hard choices, taking its prerogative and changing the formulas to make it work. The math doesn't work. That's not your fault. That's not my fault. I wasn't here. I'm dealing with the fallout from the job not being done for the last 10 years. And now we're at a point where we have to. So we're pushed into a square corner. Not angry at you. I'm just saying, I'm tired of hearing people say, well, you can do this and you can, well, doggone it, then do it. Why didn't they do it?
Yeah.
Should have been done.
Well, I think that what you're touching on, though, I think is exactly where I sense Alaskans are, both from the feedback that we're getting in the Alaska Budget Choices Project and conversations on the street and things that are appearing in the media, is that Alaskans are ready for a solution and not to have the conversation in Juneau be dominated by this question, because we have significant challenges ahead of us as a state. And it's time for us not to be having this particular debate dominate the conversation. We are coming up close on 9 o'clock. I did just want to touch on this one point, which is, again, the sales tax question as part of your formula across all of the various formulas that you looked at. And, that is a question that falls hard on many communities that already levy a sales tax. So it will fall harder on some communities and some Alaskans, many of them in your district. And it is always, it's always a bit perplexing to someone to say, in order to continue to pay dividends with one hand, we need to take money away from you with the other hand. And, there just is, it defies logic for folks to say, it's like the old question about daylight savings time. How do you, the Indian story about taking the top of the blanket off and sewing it on the bottom, and somehow you're saving time. So how do you respond perhaps to those communities that are going to be unevenly taxed, as opposed to those that are just going to have new taxes?
Well, I guess the first answer is we could just go to an income tax. We could just take it from the wealthier Alaskans that are skipping by, not paying for the state government. Is that the answer? That's not sarcasm towards you. I mean, this is part of the real question, right? It's like, hey, you don't want a sales tax? Awesome. Let's go to an income tax. They had that model out a couple of years ago. I looked at mine. It was going to be almost $7,000 a year. Great. There's an entire another month of my income gone. I'm working for 6.5 months for the government. So there's a lot of people that will get engaged finally, maybe on the wealthier end of the spectrum. We could go to an income tax. They're going to be angry. They're going to like that one, aren't they? Not really. At least a sales tax is a user tax. At least it's something you have some control over. And it's a really small one. 1.5% is tiny in the scheme of things compared to the rest of the country in many places where they got 7, 8, 9% sales tax. That's one of the problems I acknowledge right up front. Many municipalities use it. I said that in the initial brief. It's a struggle, but I guess, hey, if we don't want a sales tax, let's just go into income tax and take it from the wealthy to pay for the state government. I'm sure there's some people on here that aren't going to like that answer. It's back to my problem, right? How do you expect me to solve the problem? Do you want an income tax? Do you want a sales tax? So some people are going to say, like you did, well, let's just take the dividend. Okay, politics. I went back to the circle on that one. How are you going to pass it? Because you don't have the politics. There are Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, liberals that don't want to do that. And quite frankly, that's hard for me as well, because I've given my daughter as the example. I've said it on this floor multiple times. I heard, well, dividend, you got, federal money coming in, $1,200 for the relief funds, et cetera. It's great. I'm like, okay, so let's use my daughter for an example with 4 people in her family. The statutory dividend is $3,800 a person this year. That's, when you do the math on it, 4 times 4, that's, basically $15,000. Her income is $48,000 because her ex-husband lost his job. So that at this point, what is that, over a third of her income? Don't tell me that doesn't help people get by and survive. So, we have a program that is equally distributed across the board to every Alaskan, and it's not welfare. It's not an entitlement. I'm tired of hearing that argument about this. That's me taking money from you and giving it to somebody else. That's not how this works. This is dividends, like I had Exxon stock distributed to me from the company for giving them money to invest. So first of all, it's a dividend. It's not a welfare check. It's not a handout. I'm not taking money in the dividend from somebody else and giving it to somebody else. That's not how it works. But we are hurting the poorest amongst us that need the help the most when we take away the dividend. Now, I'm willing to do over a third of that on a 50-50. Politics is back to the answer because it might pass. If you go beyond that and we don't have some form of taxation on various fronts, and there may be other ways to do this, like the governor briefed some different ideas a couple of days ago, then I don't know how you solve the math problem. So one, I reject the argument that we are taking money from somebody to give it to somebody else, and that's just in the form of the dividend. But folks, if we want this size of government, which you're saying there about, well, this is what the people seem to want, then they're going to have to pay for it. And I'm proposing that they do. They're going to give up more. Right now, they're giving up most of it. Legislature has taken its prerogative, and instead of following the law on the statutory PFD, they're down to 500 zeroed right now. That's 1/7 of what it should be. 1/7. $525 instead of $3,800. And we've been taking it for 6 or 7 years now. So let's put something in the formula, in the law that works, that we can live with, and you're still going to need it. As a matter of fact, we're to the point now you could take almost the entire dividend, and based on the increases, you're still going to need taxes, folks, moving forward. Got news for you. That's the size of government we have. So I go back to it. I don't like this either. I get it, but I'm trying to find something that will pass. And if you don't like the dividend and you think you don't like taxes, which, whatever, that's your prerogative too, then give me something that's going to pass this legislature. Because if you take more than 50-50, a 50% split between the people and the government of the earnings that are left, then that proposal is going to fail. It's not going to pass a legislature. And we are right back here again with the same problem. And I am sick and tired of fighting over this problem. I want to solve it and move on. So we're all going to have to suck it up and agree to some things that we don't want to do to make this work. I don't want a tax. I don't want to hit our industries again. I want a constitutional spending cap. I don't think I'm going to get my way on any of that stuff. Oh, well, we're going to have to do something to pass this stuff and make it work.
Yeah. Just maybe one final question.
I got plenty of time, by the way. If you guys need to go, that's fine. I can take questions.
Okay. One final question. Callan, the state's permanent fund corporation, or the permanent fund corporation's consultant, has presented some projections about the likelihood of not being able to meet the 5% POMV draw, and provides some risk assessment of the likelihood of that occurring. And I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but they have presented some assessments that is a consideration that we should have. You've stress tested some of your proposals.
All of them, actually.
Yeah. And I don't know if Ralph Townsend is on with us, but one of the things that he a year or so ago did an assessment, a presentation that said, the biggest risk to the POMV is a period of stagflation like we had in the 70s. And, we have some evolving circumstances right now that are, the Fed does not have any, is not raising any warning flags. But I would say just in general, the public is seeing rising prices and, is concerned about inflation and the possibility of stagflation. It does exist. The recipe for it is out there. And so your proposals, at least some of them, exceed the POMV for a period of 5 or 6 years. And, that affects all future earnings. And it's sort of a little bit of playing craps in Vegas at some point, that we are betting the roll of the dice that we don't have more concerning economic conditions while we're engaged in this very risky behavior of overdrawing the POMV and risking what future revenues would look like. So what's your best argument to Alaskans that we should take the bet, that we should roll the dice on this?
Politics, because if we don't, we're going to just keep doing it. Look, I'm going to give you the answer, the same thing all the time. If I was king for a day, believe me, I would solve all this and I would go back to my FedEx job and say, you guys can have the politics. I'm done. Bye. Right. This is no fun. But it doesn't work that way. It works very slowly and painfully so at times, and not always the best answer. For things to you have this compromise solution, right? You go, well, that's not the best. I got it. It's a compromise. You're having to compromise and give up on things that you want or think are best to get something that will pass to make it work. So it's not that, I look at this and I go, hey, this is great. I can't wait to take more taxes out of the people's pockets. I can't wait to go after the businesses again for more money. I'm so overjoyed to be doing that. And I'm so overjoyed to be fighting about a dividend year after year. No, I'm not. But what we're looking at is, how in the world do we solve this mess that we've left ourselves here? I agree with you. Now, we've had Callan and the Permanent Fund Corporation have briefed us. We have talked to them. We have argued for days over what we were going to accept as the risk. And so we have gone through those very numbers with them in the last few weeks to make an assessment. Remember, I did stress test my version of a plan. And the worst possible years, including another $4 billion hit on top of that. And it still works. That's worse than we've ever seen in our entire history, back to the beginning of the permanent fund. So, but you're right. I have the same concerns. We have the potential for inflation, I think, is really high. And it's probably going to hit us at some point. If we ever lose our status as a world reserve currency, we're in big, big trouble. People just don't necessarily know where the storm is out there off the coast right now waiting to hit us. So, but I go back to the same problem. We still have the political problem. We have to solve this. And quite frankly, part of solving this problem and getting this stuff in structure so we're done is so we can put our house in order, because I see it coming. And I want to have our house in order so we know what our balanced budget is going to be. We know what we're paying. We know what our expenses are. We know we can't increase cost moving forward, except at a gentle flight path, because we changed the spending cap. so that people can invest here and we can have our act together? Are we going to have to probably bridge that fund? The governor had a plan. We've talked about that. We maybe need $1.5 billion, $2 billion of money from the earnings reserve account to bridge any plan that comes up to get us to the point where we are now balanced and paying back the CBR, our rainy day fund that is actually there for that reason as a shock absorber. Acknowledge all of those facts. We're going to have to do almost everything we do in a plan that's got some chance of passing has this bridge fund, so-called, to get us past those very numbers. I'm glad you brought it up because I didn't really talk to it, because we do have to do that. And I'll go back to people say, well, you're overdrawing the fund. Well, go back to my point. Even that other senator briefed that there's $6.7 billion sitting in that earnings reserve account that should have been paid. It's irrelevant, except to say that, well, we can't take that $1.5 billion because of future earnings. Well, we wouldn't have had that anyways if we'd followed the statute. So we're accepting risk. We're accepting a certain amount of risk to get us to a point where we are balancing the budget and paying back the CBR for that rainy day. I propose we do it sooner rather than later. I'm like, let's solve the problem now and get it done. And then we can start paying that thing back with some version of different ideas to make this work. And I am going to say one to David there, whoever's on, David Morgan, Connie Morgan, about the seasonal sales tax. I was fine with that too. That's actually my original proposal was seasonal. So we didn't hurt folks in the wintertime when we tend to have a somewhat depressed economy without tourism. I'm being told that that's almost unworkable based on, different mechanics for the government. Folks, I'm open to just about anything to make this work. Like I said, I'm not wedded to it. And I know that's a long answer because none of these are very simple problems that are being presented. But I think that moving forward, the Alaskan people more than anything want us to solve the problem. And I think every Alaskan needs to be engaged, from the wealthiest amongst us to the poorest. I think everybody should have skin in the game, which is why I'm okay with reducing the amount of the dividend, but just getting something that's fair and balanced so we can pass it. I'm okay with asking industry for a little bit. I'm okay with asking the people for a little bit. Like you said, the people seem to want this. Okay, well, you got to pay for it, and you're going to have to pay for it in multiple ways. And I'm not afraid to have that conversation. I'm a hardcore conservative guy, right? That's okay. I'm willing to talk about taxes. If this is what you want, then this is the path we're going to go down. And if you don't like a sales tax, fine. You're going to get an income tax. That's what's going to happen, folks. If you don't get sales, you're going to get an income. That's where we are.
So you've said a few times that you were okay with a reduction in the permanent fund as long as it was fair and balanced. Does that include a reduction from the 50-50 proposal?
No, and the reason is because I know inside intrinsically, talking and working the building, that if we go, and this is the reason, divorcing my personal philosophy and what I want to keep every dollar I can in my wallet for my family and my future, right? Just like all of you, I'm sure, want to do the same thing. But the answer to that is no, because if we go, and I might have said this early on, if we go past the 50-50 in either direction, a bigger dividend or a smaller dividend, we're going to fail. It's going to lose too many legislators, and we're not going to have something that's going to pass. And I've given up on statutory reform. Why? It's simple. We don't follow it, and we'll be right back here in a year or 2 or 3 or 5 fighting over the same problem. So I am reluctantly going down the path of putting something in the Constitution so it's off the table permanently. And the reason I answer the question the way I did is, regardless of my personal feelings about it, I know, and you can even see it inside the internal workings of the working group, the fiscal plan working group. If you go too far down either path, then people start bailing from that. Nope, not going to work. So it's almost half right down the middle. So you don't have to like it. I'm not saying that I do. I'm saying that a 50-50 split of what's left, what comes out of whatever that draw is, seems to be the only thing that might pull enough people on board to permanently solve this problem. So it's, and quite frankly, if it's not a 50-50, I know people have their different polling. I think they would be surprised by the results. If it's less than a 50-50 split between the government and the people next year on the ballot, I don't think it will pass. It's going to fail.
So is the answer then that there is no compromise on this point?
On the 50-50?
On the 50-50. There is no compromise on the 50-50. And what is the point of a special session or a debate or anything else if there aren't enough votes moving off, I mean, I would submit, I haven't seen that there's enough votes for 50-50. And what you're saying is that if you move off of 50-50, there aren't enough votes.
We are probably within a vote or two in both bodies of being able to pass a plan that would have a 50-50. That's how tight it is. So I don't disagree with you that, we are right on the edge of being able to pass something that's a permanent solution, a more permanent solution, because it's never permanent, right? We could even do something with the Constitution if it got that bad. I mean, people, oh, well, what if 10 years from now we'll do what we got to do? We're never really tying our hands in the future. We can always do something, override it, emergency calls, et cetera. So I hear what you're saying, and we are that tight on this. And if we fail, so be it. We might. This legislature probably will fail, knowing us, if you look at our history, recent. So great, then we fail. And the working group was for nothing, kind of, not really. I mean, we did establish some good assumptions. We agreed on the assumptions. We agreed on the problem set. We just don't necessarily agree precisely on how to solve it. Sales versus income tax, 50-50, less, more, whatever. But if we fail, and if we don't take it up in the special session or get something to the floor to pass, well, guess what next year is going to look like? And guess what the year after that's going to look like? And if you want to put us into a point where you see this just blow it all apart, then let's not solve the problem. So that's how close it is right now. And the reason, again, I go back to, look, and I'm not saying nothing's to go. I've said everything. I'm not wedded to anything. Show me one that balances the math that's going to pass. I'll probably jump on board. But if you go to a 70-30 as one representative, 70% more to the government, 30% to the people, when the government's already taken virtually most of it to begin with, that's not going to pass the people. We're right back here again, arguing about it. If I was to say I want 70% for the people and only 30% of the government, that's probably not going to pass. It's not going to pass the legislature. Why am I going there? I'm tired of wasting my time. I want to solve the problem and move on. So you're illuminating very good questions and problems we have here, but the question is whether or not we can solve it. Is it negotiable? Of course it is. I just don't know if you go past that 50-50 in either direction, based on what I'm hearing, based on the legislators I'm talking to, you lose too many in either direction.
In recent weeks, we've heard from Representative Adam Wool and Senator Natasha von Emhoff. They've presented legislation. Are you preparing legislation to introduce with?
This is going to be based off of what the working group does, because neither of those are a part of it. So I'm trying to work inside the construct of what we were given as an alternate, but I've been there a lot because one of the senators has hardly shown up. So from the majority. So I've been involved in most of the discussions and working sessions. So I will, yes, is the answer, but I'm waiting to do this in accordance with what we come up with, because if you start preparing stuff and they're not even going to take it up, well, why are you wasting everybody's time? If you got a 70-30 that nobody's even going to look at, why are you bothering to prepare legislation? Because I'm telling you right now, it's not going to go anywhere. And even on top of that, I'll just go one step further and go, fine. You think the governor's going to pass that? We've got to do our own job as a legislature. He's got his job, et cetera. But if the governor's saying if it's less than 50-50, I'm going to veto it. Great. Why are you wasting your time? That's a waste of our time. Give me one of those two plans that go a 70-30 or a $500 PFD, because that's what I know Senator von Imhoff's plan is. It's a $500 PFD. Great. You think that's going to pass the people next year? It's not. So what are we doing? I'm going back to stop with the craziness on this. I'm looking for something that's going to pass, and it can't just get to be past the legislature. It's got to pass the governor, and it's got to pass the people. And I'm looking at what the results are and where I think it's going to make it. And it's got to be something comprehensive, but some of these plans are not going to survive the legislature, even much less the other wickets it's got to jump through. So, 50-50 sounds kind of balanced to me. People stepping off of their position that support the statutory PFD, that $2,400 or so, that's 50-50, kind of in the middle. That's the amendment I put in that passed the Senate and failed the House. And for those that were supporting $1,000 PFD because that wouldn't require an overdraw, well, guess where that 50-50 puts them? Oh, about $2,400. Like, doggone it if we didn't all step off of our positions into the middle just to get something done and pass it. So it doesn't mean we have to like it. It means we need to stop fighting about it. And we need to find something that's going to work. And I'm telling you right now, we can take our chances, but if we don't have something that's fair and balanced, it's not going to pass. My 2 cents.
So I'll try and paint a picture here. the working group comes up with a proposal, maybe the legislature calls itself back into a fourth special session.
You don't say that.
The clock is already running on the 2022 elections at this point.
Yep.
And, no solution is reached, and we're going to go into another political cycle where elections will be decided based on the answers candidates are giving about these questions. And so I guess I can only ask for what's your what would your campaign pitch be going into a legislative session with no solution?
Solve the problem, make it balanced, make it fair, passable, so that we're done fighting about it moving forward. And I have been very frank. I have one of the more conservative districts in the state. They want that PFD, doggone it, no matter what. Fine. I'm trying to thread that needle to provide that best I can. But I've also not been shy about telling them, even in the most recent town hall we had, where a lot of people were, we had, I think it was 100% of the testifiers we had in the Matsu LIO, 100% were for, either the 50-50 plan or a full PFD. I was very frank in telling them, I said, you're not going to get a full PFD anymore. The support's not there. The math doesn't work. I'm not afraid to tell people what the truth is. The problem we have is a lot of legislators and politicians don't want to tell people what the truth is. They either say, I'm going to go for a full PFD, or I'm going to take it all so I don't tax you. Whatever. Stop it. Be honest. Mm-hmm. We have to be honest here and step off of our positions to make this work. And unfortunately, you have a lot of people you get in campaign mode and they say all kinds of things that end up not being really what they believe. And I am not shying away from discussions that are hard, because our politicians should have to answer hard questions. I can't support it. I would love to have a statutory PFD. It doesn't work anymore in the politics of where we are today. I don't want to tax businesses and people, but you want a certain level of government. That's about the reality of what we have. I want to see a spending cap change, so we stop doing this to ourselves 5, 10, 20 years down the road. May not get it, but I'm willing to talk about all of those things, and I will continue to do so, because I think it's the only way we're going to solve the problem. If we're honest about what it is, and that we have to step off of our individual positions. You don't want to tax because you're wealthy? Great, too bad. You want a full statutory BFD? You're not going to get it anymore. Too bad. Hard things for a politician to say. Maybe I won't get reelected because, I'm being honest. And somebody else comes in and lies to him and says, I'm going to get you a statutory PFD. All right, well, good luck when you get to the legislature next year, Bubba, because that's not going to happen, but whatever. I believe in honesty and telling people the way it is. I don't sugarcoat it. And unfortunately, I keep trying to lose this job by being brutally honest with people, and they seem to respond well to that. And so I'm going to have to take a different tack. So, but look, folks, we got to be honest with ourselves, and we have to step off our positions. And you guys are asking great questions. They're good questions. They're hard questions, and there's no great answer. And that's why I keep saying politics, because I would solve it differently if I was able to be king for a day. But like I said, I'm not. And you have to have something that's going to pass enough people. And we are right there on being able to do that. It's that thin on the margin. And if we fail, well, you can imagine what next year is going to look like.
Well, Senator, we're gone quite a bit longer than we anticipated. Appreciate your time very much today. Cheryl had to take off for another appointment, so I'll close us out. We do appreciate your time and recognize that and appreciate your honesty. We really value the marketplace of ideas and considering what the options are, and so we appreciate your time today to help illustrate what some of those considerations might be. And